Greetings, everybody. Welcome to my very first debate. I am your moderator, Miko C5, but you can call me Catmec. Today we are going to be discussing the topic of mutualism, and the setup is the last Jacobite, the gentleman who presents themselves as a blue clover in a hat. He's going to be arguing for mutualism. His opponents are Esoteric Entity, also known as Eso the Free, and Filthy Heretic, both of whom are libertarians. I myself am a libertarian as well. I feel I should disclose that before we begin. However,
well, I mean, we're all libertarians.
True,
It's just
but like...
I'm slightly more lefty.
True. However, I still felt the need to point that out. I will be trying to mostly stay silent and not butt into the discussion. However, I do reserve the right to mute any of y'all if you begin to talk over one another.
Okay.
Alright.
No problem.
You may now begin.
Okay, so what do we want to debate first? Should we start with just how property would work compared to capitalism? I feel like that's a decent place to start a debate.
Sure. First, to clarify, in a stateless society, in the way that voluntarists describe it,
we were also supposed to have a first person that we will probably be able to see on the recording being present in the members list. They were supposed to be here, but they couldn't show up. Their name is Psionic. I don't know how it's actually pronounced. I'm probably going to just...
Psionic.
This is something which I've been talking about recently, that I think we should stop calling ourselves capitalists, because it has sort of it's a meaningless term, and it sort of implies that it would be like the society that currently exists, but in reality, it wouldn't be a set economic standard, because economic standards are set by state policy. In reality, it would be more along the lines of creating freely in any way which they like. That means if you wanted to set up a mutualist co-op, then you could, or if you wanted to set up a regular business model, quote unquote regular, then that would be fine.
Well, yeah, but I think the main distinction between, say, a voluntarist communist and a voluntarist capitalist is what that person believes would naturally become the dominant system in a voluntarist society.
And that's a debate more along the lines of consensus and economic ideas. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. Going to use that term. I think that because we have been able to observe the utility which is caused by freer association, that tends to create more prosperity. I think that a stateless society would be more centered around the what you would consider the traditional business model, but I think that after a while, not necessarily too long, I think that it would naturally progress through innovation to where wage labor became less and less common, and more people were simply able to become producers, because production would be so easy and so inexpensive that anyone could do it.
I'm not in disagreement that we should have an anarchist society. I believe that a cooperative model would become more prevalent. And actually, what you said about with economic development, basically everyone becoming their own producer, I would describe that more as a late-stage mutualist society than I would a late-stage capitalist one. Because if you are solely producing things by yourself and you're not working with anyone, then there is very, very little distinction between a cooperative and a capitalist entity at that stage.
Well, a cooperative is specifically a business model where production is run and is managed by workers through what's described as democratic management, but it's really more along the lines of just polling where what I'm describing is like having a 3D printer inside of your house and trading with people in your neighborhood because they may specialize with producing things that you don't, and you may specialize in producing things that they want.
So yeah, so more like a historic mercantile thing, where but instead of it being a whole nation, it's an individual. It's the goal is produce as many things as you can by yourself.
Well, that's more what I think that it would look like. But I mean, the main reason why I think that mutualist society, from the perspective, I mean, do we want to go over the co-ops first, or do we want to go over the mutual credit system first?
Either way, I'm not particularly bothered.
Let's go over the co-ops first.
Okay. Well, the problem with co-ops, necessarily what makes them a more inefficient business model is, for one, they suffer from a problem of higher time preference. I'm trying to remember. My brain starts to spurg out when talking about time preference, and I keep confusing which one is which.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Higher time preference and lower time preference. Why can't you just use shorter or longer time preference? That makes so much more sense.
Yeah. Well, the point is that cooperative business models, it's a lot harder to actually collect capital to start these up, because unlike the traditional business model where you simply have one person collect all the resources and then buy all the resources required to produce commodities, and from there you start producing. With a co-op, you need a bunch of different people who are all going to collect their own capital. Granted, it's less, but you need more people to gather, and you need more people to buy their own individual assets, and they all need to come together. So you have a problem of time preference there, which makes it and ultimately more costly to try and invest in starting a co-op. So that's your first problem. Your other problem is that with a system of polling, or democratizing as you refer to it, even though consensus and democracy are really not the same thing, that's just simply an inefficient model of business. It'll take you longer to produce things, it'll take you longer to make business decisions, and that is detrimental to profits. So I think that ultimately that wouldn't catch on in a large scale in a stateless society. I think it would exist simply because some people, want to work in a co-op more than they do. Hierarchical, quote unquote, business structure, but ultimately it wouldn't be a prevalent model.
Well, I'd say that a capitalist model would be more efficient very much in the short term, but I think the advantage of a co-op is that it's almost uncountably more stable than a capitalist one. Because when you're starting it up, you need a small group of people to pool resources to make it, which means if it fails, then the initial like energy and time you put into it is minimized for each individual. And not only that, it's just that as they're more democratically ran, they are more stable just how they operate.
How are they more stable if it's dictated by the mob, if how they're run is dictated by polling or the mob?
I'm not entirely sure what more stable means. Like, what does stability?
A good example would be the banking crisis, where a lot of banks went belly up or suffered huge losses, yet significantly smaller and more community-based cooperative building societies and credit unions were basically unscathed.
So basically,
what country, what period of time is this?
The European and British banking crisis. I think it was it 2010 or something, around that time?
It would have been the United States financial crisis would have been around mid-2008 to early 2009.
Yeah, the banking crisis. I'm not sure if it also happened in America, but it definitely happened here.
Yeah, it was kind of a big deal here.
Yeah.
Well, it affected most of the world. I know it affected the UK.
Yeah, my understanding of America is not entirely like all that detailed, but at least in the UK, I can say that there are a lot of credit unions and building societies, specifically in Yorkshire. I'm not sure about the rest of the UK, but the banks really suffered from it. But what I was basically saying is that the credit unions and building societies survived the banking crisis significantly better than capitalist organized banks.
Well, I'm confused because you're referring to it as a capitalist structure, when in fact I don't know any definition of capitalism that is exclusionary to the co-op model. So I think it would be a lot more clear if you would use the term traditional firm.
Well, I'm using the term capitalist model because I don't really know a better way to describe it, because as it's somewhat vital to the distinction between mutualism and capitalism is that a mutualist one has a cooperative model, whereas a capitalist one would have a hierarchical model.
It's very confusing.
I mean, yeah, that's a big problem with your debate tactic, is you're using not tactic, but you're using very imprecise language.
Am I? Well, I'm not particularly well versed in this type of formal debate, so excuse me if I'm using awkward language.
It's all right. I just want to clarify, at least to the viewers, that me and Esso are not opposed to the co-op model whatsoever.
I mean, I made it pretty explicitly clear when we started that I'm okay with any sort of voluntary association, as would any other self-respecting person who calls themselves an anarchist and believes in an anarchist society.
The difference is that, for all I know, a completely voluntary society might have a decent mix of traditional firms and co-ops, and it's not done by a matter of efficiency, but it's simply the business structure that individual workers have a preference for working in.
But what I can tell you is it's probably a difference in that the UK doesn't have the Volcker rule, or didn't implement its own version of the Volcker rule, which the US did after the 2008 banking crisis, which basically absolutely hammered our local and regional banks. You're familiar with Dodd-Frank, right? Basically, it put strict regulations on how local banks could invest in what they could do with their savings accounts, and that just completely slaughtered them. And the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, just in general, was caused by the Community Reinvestment Act of 2006, which and on top of that, the Federal Reserve manipulating interest rates like it usually does.
The Community Reinvestment Act was passed in 1977.
There was a modification to it in 2006. We may not even be talking about the same law, but I know the one I'm talking about, the Community Reinvestment Act, it either was updated or passed in 2006.
It must have been updated.
Okay, that's fine.
In regards to with the UK, I can't speak for the entirety of the UK because it very much varies from region to region. But specifically in Yorkshire, you don't really get the local bank. You get the Yorkshire Bank or the Bank of Scotland or the like. We've never really had the concept of a local bank here.
You're saying that local banks weren't affected, and now you're saying that local banks, in the sense of how they work in the US, don't exist over there?
Well, what I'm saying is that community. But hang on, can you rephrase that?
You just said a moment ago that local banks, credit unions, and co-ops were not affected by the 2008-2010 financial crisis.
At least I don't believe I did. If I did, I apologize. That was a slip of the tongue.
Oh, you did say that.
Well, sorry then.
That's what we were talking about for like the last 5 minutes, as you saying that.
I was talking about how more, as you put it, traditionally organized banks suffered like really hard, whereas cooperative and community-based organizations and housing cooperatives like didn't suffer.
I mean, they're still susceptible to the problems of cooperative models. So I think and the problem essentially is that the cooperative model punishes success, because as you start to obtain more and more profit, more cost goes into maintaining the actual business structure. So the people running it have to pay more, and they're making less profit. So they make less profit as their business gets larger, and they have to pay more on top of that. So
I wouldn't say they make less profit, because as they get more, as the business expands, it'll be able to get more efficient ways of doing things. Like, instead of just hiring someone to do one job, you could get like a group of machines to do it, and it'd be like half the price.
That's my point, is that once you actually get a larger business, it costs more to produce things. I mean, yeah, you'd have a need for less labor, but that's also not really associated with expanding business. That's more associated with that's more associated with investments, which are dependent largely on interest rates and savings rates, which that's why I wanted to bring that up. And that's a big part of what makes an economy more successful, is because and this was expanded upon. I don't know if you've ever read the debate between Frederick Bastiat and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon that happened in like 1849. But Bastiat mentioned that loans and interest created a direct benefit that the borrower receives, and an indirect benefit of the payment, which the interest contributes to the accumulation of their capital. And Proudhon even consented to that and agreed that that was a valid point. I mean, I don't even really know how you're going about arguing that that's a. I mean, even mutualist economics finds that that's that's how that would work.
You know, what were you saying? You
I was
got up
saying
to
that
you were talking about the debate between what's his name and Proudhon.
Between Bastiat and Proudhon, and my point was that Proudhon even consented that interest is a form of indirect benefit on top of the direct benefit that a borrower would receive by loans, which makes non-co-op banking more efficient. And Proudhon even conceded that this was true.
Well, I mean, it's more efficient for the person giving out the loans, yeah. But
it's more
overall,
efficient for the person giving out the loans, and more profitable as a result for both the people giving out the loans and the borrowers.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it also ends up creating, to an extent, invented wealth. It's wealth that you didn't do any labor to get. You just gave someone money, and they gave you back slightly more money.
What's the problem with that?
Which creates its own problems eventually.
Well, you have to specify what those problems are.
The problems with invented wealth is it eventually leads to, inflation.
Well, no, inflation is caused by a high interest rate with a low savings rate to back it up. So there's a lot of people spending, but there aren't as many assets in the economy, and people with these assets to actually make that a consistent growth. So
well, yeah, but invented wealth is what allows them to spend more than they have the savings to cover.
No, if what you're calling invented wealth, it carries a savings rate as well as an what causes high interest rates and low savings rates generally has been market manipulation from the central banks. I mean, people don't just tends to waste all their money. They tend to save it up and then invest it into bigger commodities. So
Yeah, but you can
invented
end up
wealth
with
is this
you can end
concept
up
of
with like
invented
a
wealth doesn't really cause inflation. We know what causes inflation. I mean, I could see, to be fair, I could see where you would get the idea of just creating just making money by exchanging money would create inflation. But the problem with that is that a lot of that money that's made gets put into savings. So it's not really inflation. It's actually a perfectly legitimate investment.
Well, I'm talking about like a James Blunt situation, if you're familiar with what he did.
I don't think I am.
So James Blunt, he was the owner of a sword company in 1700s England, and he wanted the company to purchase a load of land in Ireland after the recent Irish what was it? It was the English invaded Ireland and seized a bunch of Catholic land, and he wanted to have the Hollow Sword Blade Company, which he owned, buy a bunch of that land. So what he ended up doing is he got a bunch of debt from the military, bought it all up, and then started selling his shares in return for government debt. And because it was the government that owned the land, he was trading the land directly for the debt, and it ended up fucking with the price of IOUs.
Yeah, but you're not going to get either of us defending that.
No, but the same thing could happen with a different entity. It
Uh,
doesn't have to.
Oh,
It doesn't have to be a government that ends up putting out promissory notes.
a government is structurally and economically the opposite of any economic firm.
yeah, a business, for one thing, governments can't produce any resources, and simultaneously they have a monopoly on credit. So that's a problem right there that any private banks don't actually have that problem.
Well, yeah, but my point is that you could get the same thing happening with any other form of debt to an extent. It doesn't have to be specifically government debt.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be anywhere near on that scale because that problem came from a result of the
Well,
state having a monopoly on
it wouldn't
credit.
be on the scale of the actions of John Blunt and later the South Seas Company, but it still occur.
Yeah, it would be like person to person, peer to peer on that level. In other words, known as a bad investment, but that's not necessarily any reason to start creating a centralized monopoly on arbitration to stop it.
Well, I'm not saying we should create such institution to stop it.
I'm not entirely clear how a co-op bank would be able to avoid this either.
Because the way that cooperatives work is that you don't really have the concept of interest on a loan.
Then it's not really a bank, is it?
Well, it's still a bank in that it's a place where you store like money when you're not using it, and it still gives out loans. It's just they don't really have like loan. They don't really have like loan interest.
That is a money sink. I mean, you're
You'd
going
be
to have to pay
surprised
money.
at You'd be surprised at how effective building societies are.
Actually, I would be, because you would have to still pay money to keep the lights on. Like, where's their revenue?
What happens is with a lot of specifically smaller credit unions or smaller building societies is that instead of them paying you interest for having your money in their bank, they'll like charge you a small fee to keep it there. Similar to how most traditional banks were ran before the Bank of England became a thing.
So free banking, which is not actually a co-op form of banking.
What you cut out?
He said free banking, and
free banking, which was regulated. Credit was regulated by competition within a market-based system.
Yeah, to an extent.
So it's not really a co-op model that you're advocating for.
Well, no, but it'd still be managed cooperatively. It's just how most cooperative credit unions operate.
But you just established that in function, aside from how it's managed, there's virtually no difference between how the function of traditional banks, with the exception of the state, would work, and a cooperative bank.
Well, I mean, they do the same job, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, as we've established, they do. I mean, you used Scottish free banking as your example. Well, those banks did have interest, and they did issue out loans. It's just that they regulated themselves through competition and the issuing of their credit.
I was talking more specifically about how. Wait, which bit do you mean? Because I'm not sure what you're referring to there.
You referenced banking in the UK prior to the Bank of England, and that would have been free banking. Works essentially how I described. It's not a mutualist co-op system. It's essentially exactly how you'd picture banks existing in a free market, which is I've explained it 2 times now.
Hang on a sec.
Hello, hang on a sec. I'm Mick.
Okay, Dad.
I don't know if I'm gonna put this into recording or not.
Wait, what? I've forgotten what we were disagreeing on here.
Should we just move on to something else?
Sure.
And I guess what we were disagreeing on was the function of a co-op bank versus a free market bank, because essentially, from how you were describing it, they wouldn't be any different other than they would be managed cooperatively, which,
Well,
as we've already gone over, is a less efficient economic model.
They'd have the same function, yeah. They do the same job.
Well, yeah. So, and as we've gone over, cooperatively run businesses are less efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I said, they're less efficient in the short term, but they're more stable. So over time, they're more efficient.
I don't think I don't think that's been proven.
I mean, we're just going in circles here, but yeah, we got to the problem of defining stability, and you really weren't able to. But
let's move on to another topic.
We could go on. I mean, we covered both interest in loaning, also as well as mutualist credit. So, do we want to just go on to the occupation theory of property?
Yeah, I'm better at discussing that, so let's move on to there.
Oh, god damn it. I wish I wasn't a moderator because I would love to have a say in this. We are officially moving on to the next topic of debate, that is property rights. You may begin.
Yeah, the last topic was messy.
I think it's pretty straightforward. The right to property is derived from our self-ownership, which could be demonstrated by the fact that we have agency. And the reason why necessarily private property and not occupation-based property is that what we own is based on what we can demonstrate to be a product of our agency. And until we either are no longer functioning agents or we give it up voluntarily, then it rightfully belongs to us, and this is because of contractual agreement.
Well, the thing about contracts and the like of I own myself, thusly I'm self-determining, thusly these things are mine, is that in order to have absentee-based property, you need in some way to enforce it to a degree violently. Because say you own a house and
Not
you
coercively,
haven't
but
lived.
yeah, in order to stop somebody from stealing your property,
Yeah.
and if they're going to be violent, then yeah, you need to be able to protect your property.
The thing with absentee property rights as well is that it makes very little distinction between when someone does between what state something has to be in before that someone stops owning it. Like you've mentioned before, that if there was some abandoned house that no one's been to in 20 years, they'd lose ownership of it.
Yeah, if they can't demonstrate that they own it anymore, if they can't produce a deed or they don't have any way of showing that it's theirs, then they can't demonstrate ownership over it. Forward.
Well, the thing with the whole deed thing is that very few people will follow a contract even if they sign it already, and that's with the threat of a government enforcing said contracts. So I very much doubt that you would get a society willingly imposing loyalty to contracts on itself voluntarily.
Well, you don't need to impose it, since people will have a self-interest in following contracts if they in turn want their contracts to be followed and honored.
People sign contracts because whatever agreement is being made. I mean, you could do this without contracts as well. Whatever agreement is being made for the benefit of both parties involved in the transaction. So this isn't something that needs to be imposed on anyone.
It's like when you rent movies from a library, no one gives them back. Even if you sign an agreement saying I will only keep it for XYZ long, no one ever gives them back. People are not loyal to agreements, even if they sign them.
Well, it doesn't mean
So
that the
getting
contract
people
void.
to
It means that they're not going through on their part of the agreement. So yeah, you have a dispute. You have a dispute on your hands there.
And say a good example I like to use when I'm talking about mutualist possession norms is a bike in a ditch by the side of a road.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I gotta go.
Alright.
Oh, that's a shame. I didn't even get to say goodbye.
Alright, so I guess I can answer your questions now.
So the thing of what I was saying about a bike in a ditch by the side of the road. So say there's some guy who he was cycling somewhere and he got really pissed off because his bike was too slow. He threw it in a ditch by the side of the road and got a taxi, and he hasn't come back for it in 3 days. If someone who wanted a bike were to go down to that ditch, pull the bike out, and maybe get a new tire for it or something, would it now be their bike?
Well, I mean, the person has clearly demonstrated that they no longer retain ownership of the vehicle. I mean, they've effectively abandoned it. They no longer demonstrate their dominion over it. I mean, if you own something, then it is completely within your right to do with it as you wish, including forfeiting your own ownership of it, which I think is exactly what's going on over there. But that doesn't prove your point. That just demonstrates the dominion principle in action.
Yeah, but the person pulling it out of the ditch doesn't know that they threw it into the ditch in a fit of rage. For all they know, it's just someone left a bike in a ditch. And as they were walking past, it's like, oh, hey, I need a bike, and pulls it out. Is that, would that still be okay if they don't have the specific knowledge that the person has abandoned it?
Sure. I mean, clearly the person has abandoned it, so the person taking it isn't doing anything wrong.
So, like, would the same apply to if someone drops, like, a £50 note on the ground?
No.
Why would the same
They
not
didn't
apply to if you drop a £50 note on the ground?
Well, they're not abandoning it.
Well, they're not coming back for it, are they? It's just they
abandonment
left it
requires
on the floor.
abandonment requires positive action on the part of the owner, which simply accidentally dropping currency is not active action. If anything,
I feel like that's specifically where we have a dispute then, because I would say that showing that you have occupancy or that you are using something is the positive thing that you have to do. If not, it's just presumed that it's not belonging to you. So someone dropping some money on the floor and then just leaving it, and then someone coming up 5 minutes later after they've left saying, "Oh, hey, cool, £50 note," I don't see an issue with that.
Well, I think the problem
they haven't made a display that they're still occupying it.
Excuse me. Our dispute seems to be which side has the burden of proof. Which, I mean, I'm pretty sure we can both agree on what the burden of proof is, right? The burden of proof is always going to be on the active side, never the passive side.
Yeah, I believe that it's an active side to ensure that you do. I feel like it's the actual action to show that you have possession over something, and it should be presumed unowned until otherwise.
Well, the question of you're simply having ownership of an item means that you've already satisfied the burden of proof, meaning that your ownership of something is now you're now on the passive side. The active side is I own this, say, car. Okay, well, the burden of proof says that you have to prove that you own this car. Well, I have this deed that proves that this transaction took place voluntarily between legitimate owners. This burden of proof is satisfied, and now you own it. The burden of proof is going to be with someone who believes in the occupancy principle that they are justified in taking the property if they leave it in a Walmart's parking lot. If the owner leaves their car in the parking lot.
Well, okay, firstly, you mentioned back to the deed thing, which I don't think there would be legal deeds or the like in an anarchist society to begin with. And secondly, you were talking about how it's the burden of proof to prove that someone's abandoned something, and then you went on to the parking lot thing. But the thing with the whole parking lot analogy is that by leaving your car in a parking lot, that is in of itself a display that you're coming back for it.
Well, with occupation-based property, you either have to be unable to own something the moment you're no longer occupying it, despite being able to show ownership in other ways, or you have to be able to demonstrate something objectively as a standard which exists beyond property, which so far, from what I've heard, you haven't been able to do. You're just shifting the burden of proof.
Well, no, it's also a display of intent. The reason
as for the
why a roadside at a forest would be fine to take.
Okay.
The reason that a car sat in a car park would not be fine to take because no one's in it, yet a car by the side of a road in the middle of a forest would be more acceptable to take, is because by leaving it in a car park, you have, in that action, displayed that you have an intent to come back for it.
Well, what if somebody in a parking lot, for example, just leaves their car there for years and is probably never going to come back for it? I don't know, they die or something.
Well, then the company that owns said parking lot's probably going to get specifically annoyed at this one car that's been perpetually left here and get someone to move it.
Well, but according to your argument, that wouldn't be okay because property is based on occupation, and leaving their car in a parking lot would be implying that they're coming back for it, which means that they would still own it even after they're dead. How does that work?
Because if it's on, like, say there's a Tesco and it's a Tesco's parking lot, the people who run said Tesco own said parking lot because it's part of their company. And so they would have the decision as to whether or not they can move something that's on their property, on their land, off of their land.
So the person who owns the car then doesn't actually own their car in this situation. It's actually up to the store once they leave their car whether or not they own it.
Well, no, it's belonging to the person up until It's belonging to the person up until the company decides to move it.
Which could literally be the moment they step out of their car.
You just said
then no one's going to shop. Well, then no one's going to shop at that company, are they?
Well, the whole point is not that whether or not people will shop there. The point is that it's a completely arbitrary system. Whether or not how long that threshold is, 1 second, 100 centuries, is going to be completely up to the arbitrary whims of individual stores.
Well, I feel like that comes down similar to a lot of rules. Like the difference between murder and manslaughter is entirely based on a display of intent. Were you trying to kill that person, or did you just end up happening to do it?
Well, that's not a question of principle, though. That's a question of statist legislation. This is a question of principle, which has to be universal. The moment you introduce arbitrariness is going to be the moment where it starts being a question of preference and stops being a question of principle.
The moment you reference an arbitrary state to the laws of your society, that's the moment where you're going to need a monopoly on arbitration to start enforcing this.
Well, no, but would you not agree with me that accidentally killing someone is a lesser evil than intentionally killing them?
That's really not relevant.
No, because the difference is similar to how mutualists would view property. The difference is in a display of intent.
Well, intent is also arbitrary. It's not a question of principle.
I mean, even if I would agree, I would like to point out that in the parking lot scenario, you may possibly not know whether the owner wanted to abandon the car or just left it there to do some shopping and will return a half an hour later. In this case, you would have to establish some proof of the intent of that driver, and if that driver is not available, you are going to be unable to do so, in which case you are falling back onto the principle of whether you should be allowed or should not be allowed to allow someone to repossess this car under the conditions you're trying to establish here.
Yeah, I mean, under mutualism, you've got dead people owning cars, and simultaneously the store owns the car the moment you step out of it in the parking lot. I mean, that's what happens the moment you start to relinquish self-ownership. You start getting a bunch of these nonsensical contradictions like this.
Well, it's not so much a relinquishing of self-ownership, because you're still owning yourself, and you're still having free agency in that way.
Okay, well, let me rephrase that. That's what happens when you start to abandon the concept of self-ownership being the basis of property.
The distinction would be like, say with the bike analogy, the distinction between, like, say someone leaves their bike chained up at a bike rack. That's clearly a display of intent that they're coming back for it because they've gone through the effort of locking it up. But say they forget about it for 2 months and then they die, then at that point the bike is belonging to whatever organization owns said land. If said organization were trying to do something with it without telling him, and he was still around and he did still want it back, then if he came back and said, hey, you've moved my car, or hey, you moved my bike, then yes, they'd be in the wrong. But until that point, you have no way of knowing whether or not they'd be in the wrong.
That's not the mutualist theory of occupation. That's just property rights.
You kind of made Esso's point from earlier, didn't you?
What you're describing right now is literally just a system of what you would refer to as capitalist property rights.
Well, no, because capitalist property rights, it's assumed that someone continues to own something. after they've stopped occupying it. With mutualist property rights,
you argued that if somebody you just said not even a minute ago that if somebody leaves their car in a parking lot or locks up their bike at a bike rack, it's assumed that they continue to own it. So how is that any different?
Well, it's assumed they continue to own it because they've showed an intent that they're coming back for it. If you were to leave your bike just by the side of the road next to a tree attached to nothing, then that's not a display of intent that you're coming back for it.
What about commodities where there is no such ability to do so, despite having the exact same ability? You can demonstrate self-ownership just as easily with them. I don't know, like a book, for example.
Well, if you have a book, likewise, if you have a book by a tree by the side of the road, that's probably also a display that you don't want it anymore, or that you've abandoned it.
Well, that's not entirely true. It's also entirely possible that you're having you want to read by the side of the road, and I don't know, you spotted something in the woods, you go in, you're gonna come back for it.
Well, no, that's why you take your book with you.
Well, suppose
like
you forgot to take it with you.
Human being.
Or you don't want to take it with you because you think
it's
gonna get damaged in some way.
Well, then that's your fault.
You could still demonstrate ownership over the book. You can prove that you own it somehow through, I don't know, transaction through the coin wallet you could pull up that you made.
You've shifted the burden of proof to the owner, where they have to demonstrate at all times that they own absolutely everything that they own and must continuously do so at all hours of the day.
I mean, I mentioned earlier, deeds and receipts, but really, I mean, we were talking about this off recording, but with cryptocurrencies, it's now become even easier to demonstrate that you own something. So, you wouldn't even really need any physical documents. You would just basically need your coin wallet ID, and you can prove that you bought the book or whatever.
Well, purchasing something like a book wouldn't show that you own it. It just shows that you did own it at some point.
Well, no, it means that you bought it. It means that you own it.
In the same way with the house example, how you said if someone abandoned a house for 40 years and then someone else moved into this abandoned house, it'd no longer be the original person's house if they suddenly came back to it.
No, that's the thing. You can't know that it's abandoned unless a person explicitly goes through the positive action of abandoning it.
Well, how can you tell, likewise, that someone's made said positive action to abandon it?
Putting a sign in front of it that says, "I hereby declare that this house is free to take for anyone who wishes to do so."
Well, that's not abandoning something, is it? That's just stopping caring about it and putting up an annoying sign so you can get rid of it.
No, but yeah,
there's a difference between abandoning something and intentionally getting rid of it.
Yeah, but that is what abandonment is. You're not losing it through happenstance. You're taking the deliberate action to get rid of it.
You can abandon something unintentionally.
No, you can't. No, that is actually impossible.
Well, I guess you can abandon something as in leave it behind, but there is a distinction between careless abandonment and active abandonment. I believe we should...
I lost the remote for my TV intentionally.
Yeah, basically something like that.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's just us failing at semantics with each other.
Well, no, I think we're being very clear. It's just that...
It's just I was operating on a different definition of the word abandonment.
In order to abandon something, necessarily that has to be deliberate, because otherwise, yeah, you would still think that you own it, and you would still be able to demonstrate that you own it, but at the same time that does see how that it doesn't really make sense.
Right, so we weren't operating on the same definition of abandoning something.
Yeah, I guess that's what caused all of the confusion and arguments. So from now on, let's agree that by abandonment we mean deliberately leaving something behind, whereas by losing something, we mean unintentionally leaving something behind.
Yeah.
This includes stuff like houses.
The problem the problem with the occupancy theory of property is that, well, the distinction of abandonment is going to be completely arbitrary. It's going to completely change depending on whether or not someone has lost something or not. We've already given the example of a car left in a parking lot, left for a certain period of time to be determined by the owner of said parking lot, that it now becomes the owner of the parking lot's property.
Well, it's not that it becomes their property, it's they have the right to take it off of their property. In the same way that if your neighbour's child accidentally throws a tennis ball into your garden, you're within your full rights to chuck it off of your garden.
That's just property rights, though.
Seem to be going in circles here, and not to, cut rain on anyone's parade, but we've been going on for like an hour and a half now, so.
No, we haven't. We've been going on for 50 minutes.
Well, I'm not counting the intermission, yeah. Well,
okay.
So, to clarify, if we had a case where we have somebody's signed copy of a book that's just laying by the side of the road, Jacobite believes that taking this book would be free game, but Esso and Filthy do not. However, if that book had written on its first page along the name with the owner that I abandoned this book for all to take, then all three of you agree that it would be free game to take it.
Basically, taking it would be homesteading.
It make no difference either way, whether or not it says that you're allowed to on the front.
Filthy, could you repeat what you said?
Taking abandoned property is basically homesteading.
I have no idea what the term means. Could you explain that to me?
Homesteading means making use, or not making use, but taking unowned property as your own.
Declaring ownership over unowned property or land, undeveloped property.
I see, but in this situation, this book, this property would have to be specifically have been designed as by the owner as no longer being owned due to the virtue of their abandonment, right?
Right.
Yes.
Uh-huh. But if such an explicit distinction wasn't there, Jacobite believes it would be justifiable to take such property while Filthy and Esso do not.
Yeah, it's no different from if someone leaves an old strimmer behind the back gate of their garden. You just take it.
Do we have a third topic of conversation that we should move on to, or would this be a conclusion for tonight?
I think we can do a conclusion.
I'm indifferent. I'm not bothered either way.
Very well. Any closing statements, gentlemen? Sorry for assuming your gender, but you also sound masculine.
You'd not be wrong, so...
Okay, well, I don't really... Out of all the so-called lefty economic philosophies, mutualists seem to be the most open to a voluntarist society and simply just trying to compete. But certainly sympathetic towards their economic ideals to an extent, and the reason why is because they've reached their conclusions through, if you actually read Proudhon or Stephen Pearl Andrews or Josiah Warren, some of these early mutualist philosophers, they came to their conclusion at the time, which, remember, anarchist philosophy and property relations in how it's affected by the state were being pioneered in by individualists. So they were making these new claims that hadn't really been challenged and didn't really have a historical basis to oppose before. And they saw a problem, which was essentially that the state was manufacturing conditions which ultimately harm most people, but affect is beneficial to a small group of people, politicians and corporatists essentially. Most people, they're creating conditions through economic regulations, which would essentially make most people have to become wage laborers and not be able to own property. So I'm sympathetic to them in that regard. That's something which people like Rothbard don't talk about much. Konkin, Spooner, and Tucker did also expand upon that, which is why another reason why I think they're better, honestly. But mutualists, it's a case of coming from a genuinely interesting and somewhat well-meaning place, but arriving at a seriously flawed set of conclusions.
All right, now I would like to ask Jacobite for his closing statements.
Would be that since we're all voluntarist, the only way that going to get settled definitively is if anarchism ends up established, and the ideologies that can't accept voluntarism are the ones that couldn't survive. So it really does. The ultimate settler of this will be when the time comes.
And finally, Filthy, to round up this ping pong.
Naturally, I think we all agree that none of our ideas are necessarily mutually exclusive for a voluntarist society. We all understand that a co-op model is perfectly compatible and can exist in the same free market as a traditional firm. And a society that even respects an occupational theory of property could, in fact, voluntarily form and voluntarily associate. Now, whether or not it will last, as Raposa said, I don't know. I mean, we have a lot of theoretical examples and real world, backed up by real world ideas, that there may be some problems. There may be some problems the other way around as well. But as he said, I'm going to have to agree with him on this because it's kind of my point as well, that the best way for us to possibly figure it out is to actually get rid of the freaking state so we can figure this out once and for all.
Which, based on the looks of the global stock markets, is coming real soon.
So get your Bitcoin, get your gold, and get ready, because next few months are going to be fun.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this debate. Thank you kindly for the honor of moderating it. I hope everybody had a good time, and I hope whoever watches this is not going to cringe too hard at my horrible accent, which, by the way, I wasn't even trying to control. I'm foreign. I'm sorry. I'm also Mick, Occupational, signing out. And thank you, The Last Jacobite, Filthy Heretic, and Esoteric the Free for participating in this debate. We wish Psionic a good day, even though he was absent from this. And, well, I don't know what statement to close this on, so I guess I'm just gonna say Entara Adun and go exterminate a planet of Zerg life. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Tara.